After my 2-year relationship ended, I found myself back to living alone. The idea of being single again was strange at first, but I was getting used to it. I started swiping through dating apps, Tinder being one of the first I tried. It had been a few months since the breakup, and I had met a couple of people here and there, but none of them worked out. Then one day, I was matched with a girl named Tracy. She gave me her Snapchat, and we exchanged a few messages. But, like it always goes with these things, the conversation fizzled out fast. She just started watching my stories without saying much else, and I knew that this wasn't going anywhere. In college, this kind of thing used to be a regular occurrence, but now, in my late 20s, online dating just felt immature. It wasn't as exciting anymore. It was just exhausting. I'd rather meet people face to face than through some app. I owned a corner townhome in a small suburban community. My job as an accountant paid well, but it was boring, miserably boring. After my ex moved out, I thought I'd love the peace and privacy. But after the first month, I realized something. I didn't like being alone. Maybe I just needed people around, or maybe I was more of a relationship person than I thought. Either way, loneliness was getting to me. That's why I spent so much time swiping on dating apps. It wasn't even about finding someone special anymore. I just needed to get out of the house. It was December when I posted something on my Snapchat story about Christmas. Just a simple festive post about my plans. Out of nowhere, Tracy commented. We hadn't spoken in weeks, but she brought up doing something Christmas-themed together. I was surprised. She asked if I wanted to decorate my tree with her, which seemed like an odd request, considering we didn't know each other well. But I figured why not? I had a fake tree, but it was still up in the attic. I explained it was a 2-person job to get it down, and she offered to help. I gave her the address and told her to come over around 9 that night. I wasn't expecting much, just a casual hangout. But before she came, I rushed to the liquor store to grab a couple of bottles of wine, hoping to make the evening more festive. When I got home, I quickly vacuumed and swept the floors. After the breakup, I realized how messy things could get when it was just me living there. The little things my ex used to do were now my responsibility. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting on the couch, trying to look relaxed while pretending to watch a movie. I'd set everything up to be cozy, but I kept checking my phone, wondering if she was going to flake. I sent her a message asking if she was on her way, and after a few minutes, she responded. She was outside. I went to open the door, and that's when I was shocked. She was taller than me. I'm about 5'10", and she was at least 6 feet. Her presence was overpowering, especially with the heavy perfume she wore. She walked inside, and we immediately sat down on the couch. She sat so close that our legs were touching, which felt odd given we barely knew each other. From the start, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a slight odor to her, something that clashed with the strong perfume she wore. It wasn't enough to make me disgusted, but it was noticeable. I offered her some wine, and she accepted. As we started talking, I began to feel uneasy. Have you ever met someone in person who you've been texting or talking to online, and they're just completely different from what you imagined? That's exactly what it felt like with her. She seemed socially awkward, lacking some of the subtle cues that made conversations flow easily. It wasn't anything too drastic, but it made me question if I wanted to continue the evening. Then, as we clinked our glasses and started chatting more, she spilled a huge drop of red wine on my light blue couch. My heart sank, but I didn't want to overreact. I quickly ran to the kitchen for paper towels and a sponge, while she apologized over and over. I tried to reassure her, but I was already irritated. After that, the vibe in the room shifted. It was uncomfortable, so I suggested we get the tree down from the attic, thinking that would lighten the mood. I went up to the attic, grabbed the tree pieces, and started handing them down to her. The pieces were big, and by the time I got to the final part, I realized I wouldn't be able to bring it down on my own. She grabbed it effortlessly and handed it to me. It wasn't until that moment that I noticed how strong she was, especially for someone who seemed so delicate. We set the tree up in the living room, and I poured us both more wine. I wasn't a heavy drinker, so I felt the wine's effects quickly. I started to feel a bit lightheaded, though I didn't think much of it at the time. Next, I told Tracy that my ornaments were in the crawl space. They were all from my childhood. Christmas decorations my parents gave me in bins. I went downstairs to get them while Tracy stayed in the living room. As I carried the bins back up, I started feeling more and more off. I didn't know if it was the wine or just the weird energy of the evening, but something didn't sit right. By the time I got upstairs, Tracy was gone. I figured she was in the bathroom, but when I called her name, there was no answer. I checked all the rooms and even the bathroom, but she wasn't there. I stood in confusion, trying to figure out what had happened. Did she leave? Was she just being rude? But then my phone vibrated. I checked Snapchat to see if she'd opened my message. Instead, I saw her account was gone. Blocked. I thought that was strange. Why would she just leave and block me without saying anything? It felt like she just disappeared. I went back to the couch and started feeling even more unsettled. As I sat there, I started to drift off, feeling lightheaded and weak. It wasn't until I woke up that I realized something was seriously wrong. I was in complete darkness. The TV was off and the room was still. I could barely move. My limbs felt stiff, as if I had been unconscious for a while. I grabbed my phone from underneath me, turned on the screen, and that's when I saw it. The silhouette of someone standing in front of me. I froze, my heart pounding. I couldn't believe it. It was Tracy. She was standing there, completely still, staring at me without a word. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I barely managed to whisper her name. She didn't respond. She didn't move. Finally, she turned and sprinted toward the stairs. The sound of her footsteps was heavy, almost like she was running down them in a frenzy. I heard something slam downstairs, probably the front door. I was left in shock, still trying to process what had just happened. As the minutes passed, I started to feel clearer. The fog in my brain lifted. I checked Snapchat again. Her account was gone. I looked outside through the front window. There were no cars parked outside, no trace of her. But then I realized something even stranger. I hadn't seen the car she arrived in. I hadn't seen a car at all. I checked my house, room by room, and that's when I noticed it. Every single bottle of medication I owned, prescription pills, vitamins, even a bottle of oxycodone that I'd never fully used after surgery, was gone. My vodka bottle was also missing. It took me a minute to process this, but then it hit me. Tracy hadn't just disappeared. She had stolen from me. I called the police immediately. I gave them her Snapchat username, explained the situation, and told them what happened. They went to ask my neighbor if he had seen anything unusual. After a short time, they left. I went through my home again, making sure everything was secure. Tracy was gone and no one knew anything about her. She'd left without a trace. Looking back, I realized I'd missed so many signs. Tracy's odd behavior, the way she smelled, the way she moved, it all made sense now. She wasn't who she said she was. I don't know if she was homeless or had a drug addiction, but I know she was dangerous. That night, I didn't even bother finishing decorating the tree. The whole experience left me shaken. Tracy had disappeared without a trace, but she left me with a disturbing memory I'll never forget. Throwing a Christmas party in 2021 felt like a much-needed reprieve from the chaos of that year. Between endless online classes, my exhausting part-time job, and the constant unease hanging over everything, I was desperate for holiday cheer. I decided to host a small gathering at my apartment in Knoxville. A cozy evening with just close friends, festive music, and enough eggnog to drown the gloom. By 8 p.m. the party was in full swing. Friends trickled in wearing goofy Christmas sweaters, their arms loaded with snacks and poorly wrapped gifts. My buddy Alex, always the life of the party, had commandeered the sound system, mixing holiday classics with upbeat pop hits. The apartment was alive with laughter, the smell of cinnamon candles and freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. The tree in the corner, adorned with cheap but charming decorations, twinkled like something out of a Hallmark card. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. About an hour into the festivities, the doorbell rang just as I was refilling the punch bowl in the kitchen. I barely registered it over the chatter and music, but Mia poked her head into the kitchen a moment later. "Hey," she said, her brow furrowed. "There's some guy at the door. Is he one of your friends?" I frowned, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "What guy?" She shrugged. "I don't know. He says he heard about the party and wanted to stop by." My stomach sank. That didn't sound right. I walked into the living room, where a man I didn't recognize stood awkwardly near the door. He looked out of place, mid to late 30s, definitely older than anyone at the party. His faded sweater and scuffed jeans clashed with the festive attire everyone else was wearing. In his hand was a small gift bag, the kind you'd pick up last minute at a drugstore. "Hey," I said, forcing a polite but firm tone. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a wide, almost exaggerated grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about the party and thought I'd stop by. It's Christmas after all." I glanced at Alex, who had wandered over, his expression tense. "Sorry, man," I said. This is kind of a private thing, just close friends. The man's grin faltered for a split second before snapping back into place. That's fine, he said, taking a step closer. I won't be in any trouble. Just thought I'd spread some holiday cheer. Alex stepped in front of him, his voice firm. Look, you need to leave. This isn't cool. The man's expression darkened, his grin fading entirely. It's Christmas, he said, his tone low and sharp. You shouldn't turn people away during the holidays. The room went silent. Mia hovered near the hallway, her eyes wide, while the rest of the partygoers exchanged uneasy glances. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. I think you should go, I said, stepping closer. If you don't, I'll have to call someone. For a moment, the man just stared at me, his jaw clenched. Then, just as quickly as his anger appeared, it melted away. The grin returned, stiff and unsettling. No need for that, he said, backing toward the door. I'll leave. Just wanted to wish you all a Merry Christmas. He turned and walked out, but not before giving me a long, lingering look that sent chills down my spine. I locked the door behind him and turned to Alex. What the hell was that? I muttered. That was weird, Mia said, crossing her arms. Do you think he's gone? Alex asked, peeking through the curtains. I don't see him, he said after a moment, but we should keep an eye out. We tried to shake it off and get back into the party spirit, but the mood had shifted. Conversations were subdued, and every small noise outside had people glancing nervously at the windows. About 30 minutes later, I went to grab a fresh pack of napkins from the hallway closet. As I passed the window, I froze. The man was back. He stood just beyond the glow of the Christmas lights, his figure partially obscured by shadows. He's outside, I whispered to Alex, my voice trembling. Where? He asked, immediately on edge. I pointed to the window. Alex moved to the door, but I grabbed his arm. Don't go out there, I said. I'm calling the cops. The operator assured me someone would be there soon, but the wait felt endless. Meanwhile, the man remained motionless, staring at the house. Then he started moving, slowly circling the property, his eyes scanning the windows. Alex and I locked every door and window, double-checking each one as the tension in the room grew unbearable. What does he want? Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, I said, but he's not getting in. Finally, red and blue lights flashed through the windows. As soon as the police cruiser pulled up, the man bolted, disappearing into the dark neighborhood. The officers knocked on the door moments later, but by then he was long gone. They took my statement and did a quick sweep of the area, but there was no sign of him. We'll keep an eye out, one officer said. It's not uncommon for strangers to crash parties this time of year. People let their guard down. The party ended soon after. My friends left in groups, glancing over their shoulders as they walked to their cars. Alex insisted on staying the night, and I was grateful for the company, though neither of us slept much. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. They circled the living room windows and stopped at the back door before disappearing into the woods. It was clear the man had been watching us for longer than we realized. Since then, I've been more cautious. I still host gatherings, but the doors stay locked, the guest list stays tight, and if anything feels off, I don't hesitate to call for help. Some holiday traditions aren't worth the risk. When I was about 8, my mom married my stepdad and we moved into his house, a sprawling home surrounded by 20 acres of quiet, wooded land. The property was beautiful but isolated, and it was just the three of us, Mom, my stepdad, and me. We had 2 big dogs, Bandit and Rusty, who roamed the property during the day but always stayed indoors with us at night. The house had its quirks, like creaky floors, a perpetually unfinished basement, and drafty windows that made the place feel alive with strange noises. Despite these oddities, I loved it, especially during the holidays. That first Christmas in the house, my mom went all out, decorating every room with colorful lights, garlands, and candles. The centerpiece, of course, was the Christmas tree, a towering fir adorned with shimmering ornaments and wrapped in blinking, multicolored lights. I was about 10 years old at the time, and like most kids, I was more interested in the presents under the tree than anything else. That year, I desperately wanted a remote-controlled monster truck, and I couldn't wait to find out if Santa, or as I was starting to suspect, my mom, had come through. It was Christmas Eve, and after lying awake for what felt like hours, I finally gave in to nature's call and got out of bed to use the bathroom. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The bathroom was just down the hall from my bedroom, and on my way, I caught sight of the Christmas tree, glowing softly in the living room. The sight of it made me pause. Squinting, I thought I saw a box that might contain the monster truck I'd been dreaming about, but my bladder reminded me I had more urgent things to do. After finishing up in the bathroom, I lingered in the hallway, peeking toward the tree. The glow of the lights reflected off the shiny wrapping paper, and I felt a rush of excitement. But as I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A shadowy figure in the doorway between the hallway and the living room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a boy. He looked about my age, standing with his back to me. He was leaning slightly into the living room, as if trying to get a better look at the presents. His left hand gripped the doorframe, and in his right, he held a bright red lollipop. I froze, unsure what to do. The boy wasn't anyone I knew, and the realization sent a jolt of fear through me. Who was he? How did he get in? But what scared me most was his stillness. He didn't fidget or move like a normal kid would. He just stood there, completely motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his shoulders. I inched closer to the bathroom doorway, so close I could have reached out and touched him. I opened my mouth to ask who he was, but before I could speak, he began to turn. As his head started to swivel toward me, I was overcome with a wave of dread so intense it made my stomach churn. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I could see the edge of his face now, a pale cheek, the corner of a smile that looked far too wide. Just as his eyes were about to meet mine, my mom's voice broke the silence. "Honey, are you okay?" I turned to look at her, standing in her bedroom doorway, her face shadowed by the dim light. When I glanced back toward the boy, he was gone. I pointed to the living room, stammering. There was someone. My mom sighed, walking over to me. "Were you trying to peek at the presents again?" she asked, a teasing smile on her face. Before I could protest, she gently guided me back to bed. I fell asleep quickly that night, the fear fading as dreams of remote-controlled monster trucks filled my head. The next morning, I woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart. Sure enough, under the tree was the monster truck I'd wanted, along with a few other toys that made my Christmas unforgettable. Years later, when I was a teenager, I mentioned the incident to my mom. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss it as a dream or my imagination. "That house had its moments," she said cryptically. "What do you mean?" I pressed. She hesitated, then admitted, "A few strange things happened over the years. Doors closing on their own, footsteps in the hall when no one was there. But I didn't want to scare you. I've often wondered about that boy in the hallway. Was he a figment of my imagination, a product of childhood fears and holiday excitement? Or was he something else entirely? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. I'll never forget the feeling of his gaze, even if I never saw his eyes." It was December 2022. My girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Pocono Mountains. We had rented a super cozy-looking Airbnb decked out with Christmas decorations. It was nicely located, with a great view and a big property not far from a cute little village. To make things even more festive, a snowstorm was coming that night. We set out a little earlier to allow ourselves time to get groceries and set everything up in the Airbnb. The drive from the city to the Poconos was about 4 hours. We made decent time, stopping at a Family Dollar for snacks and groceries, and then went straight to the Airbnb. We turned onto the uphill gravel road that led through a clearing in the trees toward the property. The house was surrounded by woods, with a big deck and a hot tub, which sounded perfect, especially with the snowstorm rolling in. Christmas decorations were everywhere on the property, lit up reindeer, a big snowman, and giant candy canes lining the walkway to the front deck. We took a few trips to bring everything inside. My first impression? It had the very cozy, welcoming vibe we had expected from the pictures. There was a Christmas tree in the corner, stockings hung on the walls, and a bunch of smaller decorations scattered about. The house smelled like wood, which reminded me of a country log cabin, though it was just a regular house. Next to a big fireplace in the living room, there was a stack of logs. There were 3 bedrooms, but of course we only needed 1. We put our luggage and things in a second bedroom. I did the usual, checked the fridge, turned on the TV to see if there was cable or Netflix, and looked out all the windows. There was an upstairs area with a loft, a pool table, and a couple of couches. Then there was the basement. For the hell of it, I went down to check it out. The basement was fairly big for the size of the house, but felt disconnected from the rest of the Airbnb. It was dark and cold, more of a space for laundry or a workspace than a hangout area. Then, there was a knock at the front door. I hurried to answer it. There stood a guy in his late 40s, wearing gray sweatpants and a yellowish-brown jacket. He smiled and said, "How are you folks doing?" I replied, "Good," and asked if he was the Airbnb host. He said he ran the place with his brother. I asked for his name, and he said it was Tom, and that he lived just up the road if we needed anything. I thanked him, and he walked away. I thought it was odd that he knew I was with Charlotte since she hadn't come to the door, but maybe Mike, the host, had mentioned it. It was pitch black outside, and snow was falling heavily as we cranked up the heat and started preparing the dinner we had bought: chicken thighs, broccoli, potatoes, and cornbread. It was a bit of a grab bag meal, but we were just looking forward to relaxing. We ate on the couch with the Christmas tree lights on, creating a nice cozy glow, and watched the Polar Express. Afterward, when we felt like we had digested enough, we went outside to hop in the hot tub. I turned on all the Christmas lights outside, and as we sat there, watching the snow fall, it felt like absolute bliss. Then, the bubbles in the hot tub stopped, and everything went quiet. We heard footsteps from somewhere on the property. Charlotte and I exchanged looks. I asked her if I should shout out to see who it was, but she whispered, "No." The footsteps moved further away, and then they stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer, but deep down, I knew those footsteps were human. After the hot tub, we went to take showers before bed. However, the hot water didn't last more than 2 minutes. The water suddenly turned ice cold. We screamed and jumped out of the shower. I messaged Mike, the host, and he responded quickly, saying it was odd and that someone would come to check the hot water heater tomorrow. We went to sleep after our half shower, but in the middle of the night, we were suddenly awoken by loud bangs on the front door. Charlotte was terrified and shaking. I said I was going to check who it was, but she insisted I stay in bed and not make a sound. I was actually relieved she said that. No part of me wanted to know who was at the door in the middle of the night. There were about 3 really loud and aggressive knocks before they stopped. We sat up in silence for a few minutes, whispering. I locked the bedroom door for extra security, and we waited, listening. After about half an hour of sitting in silence, we eventually managed to drift back off to sleep. First thing in the morning, I messaged Mike again, asking about the knocks at the door. He responded quickly, sounding just as confused as we were. He suggested we alert the authorities if anything like that happened again. Honestly, it wasn't the most reassuring response, but what else could he say? The snow was still coming down as I went outside to wipe the snow off my Jeep. While doing so, I noticed footprints in the snow. They looped around the house, and I remembered the knocks from the night before. The footprints looked fresh, and I realized they hadn't been there when we arrived. It had snowed all night, so surely the prints would have been covered up by now. I heard footsteps approaching again, and I saw Tom walking from around my car. I told him about the hot water issue and the footprints in the snow. He looked at them and said, "There are a lot of strange folks out here who go snooping around at night." He seemed a bit too casual about it, though. I asked if we should avoid using the hot tub at night, and he said it wasn't a problem. People around here were harmless. Tom went inside the house and walked around before heading down to the basement to check the water heater. Something felt off, so I messaged Mike again, asking if Tom was the plumber. Mike replied, asking if I meant his brother. I responded, "No, Tom's the guy who came to the door." Mike said, "My brother? He doesn't run the Airbnb." Everything clicked. I rushed to Charlotte, told her to pack up quietly, and we needed to leave. We grabbed our things and headed out in one trip. We got in my car, and as I started it, I looked in the rearview mirror. Tom was quickly approaching the back of the Jeep. I put the car in drive and sped away as fast as I could. On the road, we called Mike to explain everything. He said the police were on their way, but when they arrived, they didn't find anyone in the house. Mike called us later, saying that he didn't know anyone matching Tom's description. What disturbs me most is that man was watching us the entire time, from the moment we arrived to when we were in the hot tub to the middle of the night. He was probably the one banging on the door. Who knows what his intentions were, but we were lucky to get out when we did. It was the early 90s during Christmas break, when I was around 7 or 8 years old, living in Miami. That holiday season, like most, was spent at home with my great-grandmother, Nana. For context, my Nana was more than just a caregiver. She was my protector, my confidant, and the fiery southern redhead who made me feel safe in a world I didn't yet understand. Nana had lived with us for as long as I could remember. She'd become my full-time caretaker after my parents uncovered dark family secrets involving her second husband, an abusive man who preyed on his grandkids, including my father and aunts. Though I was born after his death, the scars of his actions left my family hyper-vigilant about my safety. Playing outside alone was strictly forbidden, and sleepovers were out of the question. That Christmas, I'd received a shiny new pair of rollerblades, and I couldn't wait to try them out. Our walkway, smooth and perfect for skating, became my makeshift rink. Nana, ever watchful, sat on the porch with a book, keeping an eye on me as I wobbled and glided back and forth. It was a picture-perfect afternoon until the phone rang. This was before cordless phones were common, so Nana hesitated. She looked at me, deliberating whether to bring me inside. I begged her to let me stay, promising I wouldn't leave her sight. "Stay where I can see you," she said firmly before stepping inside, leaving the main door open so she could keep an eye on me through the screen. The call only lasted a few minutes, and when Nana returned, she seemed relieved that everything was as she'd left it. Settling back into her chair, she resumed her book while I gained confidence in my skating. I was finally getting the hang of it, and as I glided back and forth, I felt a surge of pride. "Sing while you skate," Nana instructed. "I need to hear you." So I belted out a garbled version of NSYNC's Digital Get Down, the sound of my off-key singing filling the yard. But as I skated, a sense of unease began to creep in. It started subtly. A white van rolled down the street, moving unnervingly slow. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was just a kid, blissfully unaware of the dangers that could be lurking. I was behind the chain-link fence that surrounded our yard, and in my young mind, that meant I was safe. The van stopped directly in front of our house. My singing faltered, replaced by the soft hum of its engine. The passenger door opened, and an extremely tall man stepped out. "Hey there," he called, his voice light but not warm. "Can you help me out? I'm looking for the highway." I froze, clutching the gate for balance. My stomach twisted with unease, though I couldn't explain why. I pointed vaguely in the direction I thought the highway was, avoiding his gaze. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, kid. Are you having a good Christmas?" I nodded cautiously, glancing toward the porch. Nana was still there, her head buried in her book. The man took a step closer to the gate. "Do you like toys?" he asked. "I've got a Barbie house my daughter doesn't want. You can have it if you want." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shook my head, inching backward. "Come on," he urged. "You can come to take a look. It's right here in the van." "No, thank you," I said quietly, gripping the fence tighter. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look I didn't understand but instinctively feared. "Are your parents home?" he asked, stepping closer. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward on my skates. Panic took over and I screamed, "Nana!" The man reached for the latch on the gate just as I turned to run. My skates betrayed me, and I fell hard onto the concrete, hitting the back of my head. Stars danced in my vision as I tried to scramble to my feet. Then, like a hurricane, Nana burst through the door. Her fiery red hair caught the sunlight as she charged forward, wielding a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. "You get the hell away from her!" she roared, her voice echoing down the street. The man froze for a split second, his eyes wide with fear. He turned and bolted back to the van, the driver flooring the gas pedal before the door even closed. Nana didn't stop. She chased after the van, shouting and trying to catch the license plate number. When she returned, she scooped me up and carried me inside, locking every door and window before calling the police and my dad. Within minutes, paramedics arrived to tend to my scrapes, and officers took our statements. My dad showed up shortly after, his face pale with anger and fear. I didn't step outside for the rest of the holiday break. Years later, as a teenager, I learned the full extent of what had happened. Just before Christmas, there had been a report of a man breaking into a woman's apartment in nearby Broward. He had assaulted her and was still at large. The description Nana and I gave, balding, bright blue eyes, over 6 feet tall, matched the attacker perfectly. We never found out if he was caught or if he and the van driver had planned something sinister together. But one thing I know for sure, whatever that man had planned for me, Nana stopped it. Thank God for her. Working retail during the holidays is like juggling candy canes in a snowstorm. Chaotic, festive, and a little nerve-wracking. As an assistant manager at a trendy boutique in Atlanta's busiest mall, I thought I'd seen it all. December 2021 was no different. The mall buzzed with holiday energy, gleaming decorations, the scent of cinnamon wafting from kiosks, and non-stop Christmas music echoing from every corner. Shoppers darted from store to store, arms laden with bags, faces flushed with holiday excitement. I loved the hustle and bustle of the season, even if it meant back-to-back shifts with little time to breathe. That Friday started like any other during the holidays. By noon, the boutique was flooded with last-minute shoppers eager to grab gifts for their loved ones. Our trendy, affordable clothing always attracts a crowd. I barely had a moment to glance at the clock, let alone sit down. By 6 p.m., the mall was at its peak, crowds weaving through the walkways, the sound of laughter and chatter mixing with the occasional cries of cranky children. I was ringing up a customer when I noticed him. A man stood near the large fountain just across from the boutique. He wasn't shopping or even glancing at the stores around him. He just stood there, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a dark, oversized coat. At first, I thought nothing of it. The fountain was a common meeting spot for families or friends. But something about him caught my attention. He wasn't distracted by his phone or casually looking around like most people. His eyes were locked in my direction, unmoving, unblinking. I shook it off. The store was too busy for me to dwell on a stranger's behavior. But every time I glanced back, he was still there. The same intense gaze, the same unsettling stillness. By 7 p.m., the crowd began to thin, and the frenetic energy of the day gave way to a quieter hum. I was arranging a display of scarves near the entrance when I saw him again. This time he was standing closer, just outside the store, pretending to browse the display. But his glances weren't subtle. His eyes darted toward me every few seconds. My stomach churned. "Ella," I said softly to my coworker, who was folding sweaters a few feet away. "That guy's been hanging around for hours. He's over by the entrance now." Ella looked up briefly, her brow furrowing. "Weird," she said. "Maybe he's waiting for someone? Let me know if he does anything." I nodded, trying to dismiss the growing unease. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was just killing time. But as the minutes ticked by, his presence became harder to ignore. Every time I looked up, he was there. Sometimes pretending to browse other stores, other times just standing in the walkway watching me. At one point, I stepped into the stock room to grab more inventory. When I came back out, Ella greeted me with a reassuring smile. "He's gone," she said. "Maybe he finally got bored." I wanted to believe her, but as I walked toward the entrance to adjust the mannequin, I caught sight of him again. He had returned to the fountain, standing in the same spot as before, staring directly into the store. The last hour of my shift dragged. My nerves were on edge, and every time I looked toward the entrance, I half expected to see him there. By the time we closed at 9 p.m., I felt a wave of relief. Ella offered to walk me to my car, but I waved her off, embarrassed by how jumpy I'd been. "I'll be fine," I said with a forced smile. "It's probably nothing. Big mistake." The parking lot was eerily quiet when I stepped outside. Most of the cars were gone, and the distant hum of traffic was the only sound. My car was parked in the far corner, where the lights barely reached. It had seemed like a good spot earlier in the day, but now the shadows felt oppressive. Halfway to my car, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I told myself it was just another shopper heading to their vehicle, but the sound didn't fade. It stayed steady, matching my pace. I tightened my grip on my bag and quickened my steps. My breath hung in the cold air as I scanned the rows of cars for anyone else. The lot was empty. The footsteps grew louder. I turned my head slightly, and my heart dropped. It was him, the man from the mall. He was walking toward me with an unsettling calmness, his hands still buried in his coat pockets. "Hey," he called out, his voice unnervingly cheerful. "Wait up!" I froze, gripping my keys like a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stopped a few feet away, a smile spreading across his face. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I just thought you looked nice. Figured you might need some company." I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. "No thanks," I said firmly. "I'm fine." "Come on," he said, his tone still light but persistent. "It's Christmas. You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm good," I repeated louder this time. "Please leave." For a moment, he didn't move. We stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, without thinking, I hit the panic button on my car key. The horn blared, shattering the silence of the lot. The man flinched, his smile fading. He muttered something under his breath and turned, walking quickly back toward the mall entrance. My hands were shaking as I climbed into my car and locked the doors. I couldn't even start the engine right away. My fingers felt numb, and my mind raced with what could have happened. Instead of driving straight home, I pulled into the parking lot near the mall's security office. The guards took my story seriously and immediately sent someone to check the lot. They found him within minutes, loitering near another entrance. When they brought him back to the office, he was all smiles again, insisting he hadn't done anything wrong. "I was just being friendly," he said with a shrug. "It's Christmas, for God's sake." But his behavior spoke volumes. The way he'd followed me, the persistence in his voice, it wasn't friendly. It was predatory. The guards escorted him off the property and warned him not to return. I didn't go back to work for the rest of the holiday season. When I finally did, Ella and I made a pact to walk each other to our cars every night. Christmas used to be my favorite time of year. Now, it's a reminder that even in the brightest, most cheerful places, darkness can find a way to creep in. And no matter how festive the season, you can't always ignore the shadows. Being a professional driver means my life is a constant blur of congested highways, honking horns, and impatient people. By the time the weekend rolls around, I'm desperate for a break, a chance to breathe in silence and escape the chaos of the city. Hiking has become my therapy. It clears my mind, balances my mood, and gives me a sense of freedom that the open road never could. Christmas morning in 2022 was no different. I wasn't due at my sister's house until the afternoon, so I decided to spend the morning exploring a trail I'd been meaning to try just outside of Anchorage. It was one of those crisp, blue sky winter days when the air was sharp but refreshing and the snow glistened like powdered sugar. I packed light, water, a thermos of coffee, a protein bar, and my camera. By 8 a.m., I was on the road, leaving the city behind as the landscape transformed into frosted forests and rolling white hills. When I reached the trailhead, I was pleased to find mine was the only car in the lot. That's the beauty of hiking on Christmas morning. Most people are home opening presents, leaving the wilderness all to myself. The forest was pristine, blanketed in untouched snow. It was so quiet that I could hear the crunch of my boots echoing with every step. The spruce trees stood tall and heavy with snow, their branches forming delicate arches overhead. I stopped occasionally to snap photos of the sunlight filtering through the trees. The serenity was exactly what I needed. About 20 minutes in, I heard it. Laughter. It was faint, almost like a child's giggle carried on the breeze. I paused, scanning the trail behind me. There was no one. The snow was untouched except for my footprints. A trick of the wind, I told myself, or maybe a bird. Animals in the wild can make surprisingly human-like sounds. Shrugging it off, I continued down the path, deeper into the woods where the trees grew closer together, their snow-laden branches creating a dim, almost tunnel-like effect. The laughter came again. This time it was closer. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding far too loud in the stillness. Silence. My heart began to pound, but I forced myself to keep walking. I'd hiked enough remote trails to know how sound can behave strangely in the woods. Echoes bounce off trees in unexpected ways. Still, the sound had unnerved me. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the scenery, pausing to take more photos, but the laughter was persistent. It followed me. Sometimes it was faint, distant like it was coming from far ahead. Other times it was so close I felt like someone was right behind me. But every time I stopped and turned, the trail was empty. No footprints, no movement, just the whisper of the wind and the muffled quiet of the snow. After another half mile, I reached a clearing where the trees opened up around a frozen pond. The scene was breathtaking, like something out of a holiday postcard. I set my backpack down and pulled out my camera, determined to focus on the beauty of the moment. Then the laughter came again. This time it wasn't playful. It was sharp, taunting, echoing across the clearing like it was mocking me. "All right, who's out there?" I shouted, my voice breaking slightly. Silence, and then I saw it, a shadow. It flickered between the trees on the far side of the pond, quick and deliberate, disappearing before I could make out any details. My stomach clenched as adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my backpack and started back toward the trailhead, walking quickly but trying not to run. My mind raced with every logical explanation I could muster. Kids playing a prank, someone else out for a hike. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. There were no other cars in the lot, and there were no other footprints in the snow. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more erratic, seeming to come from all around me. My quick walk turned into a jog, and my jog turned into an all-out sprint. The trail, which had seemed so peaceful that morning, now felt like a maze, the towering trees closing in around me. I reached the parking lot gasping for breath, my legs trembling from exertion and fear. My car was still the only one there. I threw my backpack in the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors with shaking hands. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the trailhead. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could tell it wasn't just my imagination. The shadow was real, and it was watching me. I didn't stick around to get a better look. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the lot, leaving the trailhead and its haunting silence behind. When I got home, I went through the photos on my camera, hoping to find something that would explain what I'd experienced. But there was nothing, just serene shots of snow-covered trees and the frozen pond. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a mix of solitude, the quiet woods, and my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I think back to that shadow at the edge of the trees, I feel the same cold dread that I did that morning. I haven't been back to that trail since. It was December 2005, and I was back home in my small, snowy hometown for the holidays after moving away for college. The familiar sights and sounds of my childhood were comforting, and it felt good to be back, even if only for a short time. I spent the week catching up with old friends and enjoying the simplicity of small-town life. On my last night there, I met up with my good friend Anna for an impromptu late-night adventure. It was 3 a.m., and the world outside was peaceful, blanketed in snow. The idea of a spontaneous sledding trip seemed perfect, especially since the hill just outside town had been one of our favorite spots as kids. We hopped in her car and made our way to the hill, laughing and reminiscing about past winters spent sledding down the slope. The cold air and the thrill of the ride made it all feel like a nostalgic escape. After a few turns down the hill, we found ourselves standing at the top, catching our breath, preparing to go again. That's when something stopped me. "Wait," I said, holding up my hand. Anna turned to me, confusion in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I couldn't explain it at first, but I felt it, a growing sense of unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my chest tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put into words. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I just have a really bad feeling. We need to leave now." Anna hesitated, probably thinking I was overreacting, but the look on my face made her reconsider. She finally nodded, and we packed up quickly, driving back to my family's house. My hometown was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. Crime was rare, and everyone knew everyone else. It was a place that felt safe, until that night. As soon as we arrived back, I felt compelled to check all the locks on the doors. "Why are you locking everything?" Anna asked, watching me curiously. "I don't know," I replied, still unsettled. "Just something feels off." I checked every window too, finding several of them left unlocked. It was unusual, but I tried to brush it off. My flight back to campus was only a few hours away, and I was running on pure adrenaline. I finally managed to get about 2 hours of restless sleep, my mind still racing. When I woke up, I decided to step outside for a moment to take in the fresh air and admire the snow one last time before I left. The world outside was still and quiet, the kind of peaceful morning I had always loved. I wandered over to the front yard, where a massive pine tree stood, its branches heavy with snow. The way the snow settled on the tree had always looked like something out of a postcard to me. But something caught my eye. The pristine blanket of snow around the tree was disrupted by massive footprints, human-sized tracks that led toward the backyard. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my uncle had been out there earlier, or someone had gone for a walk. I clung to those explanations, desperately trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But then the uneasy feeling from earlier returned with a vengeance, stronger than before. The tightness in my chest, the sense that something wasn't right, took over again. Then I saw him. To my left, a man emerged, running full speed toward me. He was huge, at least 300 pounds, and about 6 feet tall, but for his size, he moved with startling speed. What struck me even more than his speed was his focus. His eyes locked on me, his face twisted with intent. He wasn't just jogging, he was coming after me. I froze, paralyzed by fear. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The panic hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I was trapped in place. But finally, with every ounce of strength I had, I snapped out of it and turned, bolting for the front door. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and immediately ran to the window. My heart was pounding in my chest as I peered outside, desperate to see if he was still there. He was. The man stood on my porch, his hand gripping the doorknob as though testing it. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. Then he turned his head, and I followed his gaze. A white van was parked in the street, and a second man was sitting behind the wheel, staring directly at my house. He raised his hands in an impatient gesture as if asking, "Well, what now?" The runner shook his head, frustration evident on his face, then signaled something back to the man in the van. With one last glance at my door, he walked off, climbed into the van, and they drove away. I stood frozen at the window, my heart still pounding in my chest, trying to process what I had just witnessed. When I could move again, I ran to wake up Anna, dragging her out of bed and insisting that we check every inch of the house. We started walking through the property, and that's when we saw it, the footprints. They weren't just by the front door. They circled the entire house, leading to every door and every window, as if the man had been testing every entrance. Anna tried to rationalize it, saying I was overreacting, but I knew better. The look in the man's eyes as he ran toward me wasn't just unsettling, it was malicious. It was the look of someone who had been watching, waiting, and if he had caught me, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. That morning, I was more certain than ever that something had been watching me, and that I had narrowly escaped something much worse. About 4 years ago, when I was 8 months pregnant, something happened that still gives me chills to this day. My belly was big and unmistakable. I was nearly ready to welcome my baby into the world. It was a cold December evening, and I had gone to the local mall to finish up some last-minute Christmas shopping. By the time I was done, it was around 9 p.m., and the mall was quieting down. The holiday rush had thinned, leaving only a few scattered shoppers and staff. I stepped out into the crisp night air, my shopping bags in hand, and headed toward the parking lot. At this mall, the parking lot is across a small road that circles the building, so you have to cross the road to reach your car. As I approached the crossing, I noticed a man standing in the middle of the road. His posture was stiff, and he was facing directly toward me. When our eyes met, an icy unease washed over me. He didn't glance away like most people would. His gaze felt deliberate, almost piercing. I quickly broke eye contact and continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. 2 other men walked past him, heading into the mall, but he didn't so much as glance at them. His focus stayed locked on me. "Excuse me, can you help me?" His voice called out, carrying across the cold air. Being from the South, politeness was ingrained in me. Even though my instincts screamed at me to keep walking, I stopped and turned toward him, keeping a safe distance. "What do you need?" I asked cautiously. He looked around as if checking to see if anyone else was nearby, then said, "Can you help me start my car? I think my battery's dead." The request didn't sit right with me. Why ask a pregnant woman for help when 2 perfectly capable men had just walked by? It didn't make sense. Alarm bells went off in my head. "Sorry, I can't help," I said, my voice firmer now, and resumed walking, picking up my pace. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him start to follow me. His footsteps quickened to match mine, and my pulse spiked. I gripped my keys tightly in my hand, my thumb hovering over the panic button. "You're not going to help me?" He called after me. His tone had shifted, growing more insistent, almost angry. I didn't respond. My focus was on getting to my truck, which was parked a few rows down. I unlocked it remotely as I approached, determined to get inside and lock the doors as quickly as possible. But just as I reached my truck, his pace turned into a jog. I could hear him behind me, his voice rising. "I just need a jump. Come on!" I yanked open the door and climbed in, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers fumbled with the key, my hands trembling so much that I couldn't get it into the ignition. Before I could start the truck, he was there, pounding on the driver's side window. His face was inches from the glass, twisted with frustration. "Open the door!" he yelled, his voice sharp and commanding. He grabbed the door handle and yanked on it repeatedly, rattling the entire truck. Panic surged through me, but so did something else: determination. I wasn't going to let him harm me or my baby. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands, and rolled the window down just an inch, just enough for him to hear me. "I'm not going to tell you again," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Back off." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and I braced myself for whatever might come next. Then, without a word, he stepped back. His face softened into an unsettling calm, and he simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. Even though he was gone, I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I started the truck and drove home, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got inside my house, I locked every door and window and sat down to catch my breath. The whole experience was a harsh reminder of how quickly an ordinary night can take a dangerous turn. I'll never forget the way his eyes felt like they were stripping away my sense of safety, or the way my instincts screamed at me to act fast. Trust your gut, it's there for a reason. That night, it may have saved my life and my baby's. Something unsettling happened today, about 10 hours ago, and the more I replay it in my head, the creepier it feels. My older sister, let's call her Ava, wanted to finish her Christmas shopping, so she made a list of stores to hit. We live in Northern Virginia, and one of her stops was the local mall. I tagged along for 2 reasons. One, Ava's petite and has a habit of attracting attention, even when she doesn't mean to. And 2, she needed help deciding what to get me for Christmas, so I was supposed to point out things I liked. We'd already browsed through a few stores, Hot Topic, American Eagle, but hadn't had much luck finding anything for me. As we wandered, Ava suggested we check out Spencer's. They usually have nostalgic stuff like old Nickelodeon merch, and she thought I might like something from there. It was mid-afternoon when we walked in, and the store wasn't crowded. The back of Spencer's is where they keep all the t-shirts and quirky gifts, so that's where we headed. I was flipping through the racks, looking for something in my size, when a man entered the same section. He looked ordinary enough at first. Maybe late 30s or early 40s, average build, short dark hair, and a goatee. He was holding a small coffee cup and wearing a neutral expression. I didn't think much of him, even though we were the only 3 people in the back of the store. As I flipped through the shirts, he spoke. "They've got a lot of stuff in this store," he said casually. I glanced up, gave a polite nod, and went back to browsing. But then I noticed something odd. He wasn't looking at the t-shirts anymore. His gaze kept shifting between Ava and me. His movements felt too deliberate, his presence too close. Ava had noticed too. "Maybe we should look somewhere else," she whispered, her voice tight. We moved to another rack, trying to shake him, but he followed, staying just a few feet behind us. Ava, who's usually calm, was visibly unsettled, and I was starting to feel the same. Something about the way he lingered, his eyes darting between us, felt predatory. I'm not a small guy, 5'10", 215 pounds, but that didn't make the situation any less unnerving. "Ready to leave?" Ava asked, her voice louder now, almost desperate. "Yeah," I said, pointing toward the front of the store where the employees and other customers were. As we walked away, I felt the man's eyes burning into the back of my head. Then I heard it. "Hey man." I ignored him, quickening my pace, but he wasn't done. "Hey man." His voice was more insistent this time. I glanced back, and there he was, hand outstretched like he wanted to shake hands. His eyes locked onto mine, but there was something off about his expression, something too intense, too eager. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was nice to meet you," he said, smiling in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I frowned. "Nah, I'm good, man," I replied, turning to walk away. His smile disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "Yeah, well screw you too, man." I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His voice had turned aggressive, his words echoing in the small store. Ava, who had kept walking toward the exit, finally noticed the commotion. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. "Just keep walking," I said firmly, glancing back to make sure he wasn't following us. Thankfully, he stayed where he was, muttering something under his breath. We made it to the front of the store, the fluorescent lights and chatter of other shoppers offering a strange sense of relief. But I couldn't relax. My heart was pounding, my adrenaline still surging. We ducked into another store to catch our breath, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear. When we finally got to the car and drove away, I felt a knot of tension in my chest that wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my head. The way he seemed to focus on us, the unsettling persistence in his voice. The drive home was quiet. Ava tried to make small talk, but I was lost in thought. What would have happened if we'd stayed in the store longer? If I'd let him get closer, it was a stark reminder of how quickly a mundane day can turn into something sinister. Trust your instincts. Stay aware. You never know when someone's smile hides something far darker.